to hear from our panel this afternoon on this very exciting topic, inclusive approaches to loss and damage agenda. We have an excellent panel who will talk about the work that they do in their organizations to help address the issue of loss and damage. I'd like to introduce the panel for this afternoon. We have the Honorable Tuasulusu Cedric Schuster, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment, as well as Lands of the Government of Samoa. He is also the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. I'd like to invite the Honorable Minister to please, if you could come up here. We have Ms. Tanya Gerard, Chief Advisor Maori, the National Emergency Management Agency from New Zealand. Ms. Gerard. We have Mr. Jerome Ilijan, I hope I have pronounced your name properly, my apologies, Chief Policy Research Development Division, Climate Change Office, Climate Change Commission, Republic of the Philippines. We also have Ms. Michelle Hedgeland, Executive Director, ActionAid Australia. We have Mr. Anish Arishta, Executive Director of Youth for Environment Education, Development Foundation, Nepal. And finally, we have Mr. Animesh Kumar, Head of UNDRR, Bonn Office. My name is Philomena Nelson. I'm the Climate Change Adaptation Advisor, but also responsible for loss and damage in the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program that is based in Apia, Samoa. Happy to welcome you all to this session this afternoon. Without further ado, I would like to invite the Honorable Minister, Honorable Tuasulusu Cedric Schuster, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment and Minister for Lands of the Government of Samoa and Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, for his welcome remarks.
Talofa, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. We gather here today at a critical juncture in our fight against climate change. The loss and damage agenda before us is not merely a policy discussion. It is a call to action that echoes the voices of millions facing the harsh realities of the changing climate. Climate change is no longer a distant threat. It is a present crisis. From the submerged coastlines of island nations to the scorched fields of once fertile lands. The consequences of collective inactions are evident. The loss and damage agenda recognizes a stark truth. Despite our best efforts to mitigate and adapt, impacts of climate change are now unavoidable. When we speak of loss and damage, we're not just referring to economics metrics or environmental statistics. We're talking about homes swept away by rising seas, livelihoods destroyed by prolonged droughts, ecosystems irreversibly altered, cultural heritage erased by extreme weather events. These are not mere data points. They represent shattered dreams, disrupted lives, and altered futures. Addressing loss and damage is our moral obligation. It is unconscionable that those who have contributed least to the climate crisis, often the poorest and the most marginalized communities, bear the heaviest burden of its impacts. Our response must be rooted in justice and equity. To tackle this challenge effectively, we must focus on 5 critical areas. The establishment of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage is a significant step forward. However, we must ensure this fund is more than a symbolic gesture. It must be accessible to those who need it most, predictable in its disbursements, adequate to meet the scale of the challenge. Financial aid alone is insufficient. We must prioritize knowledge sharing and capacity building. The Santiago Network should be at the heart of our efforts, catalyzing technical support for vulnerable nations. Our goal is to empower local communities to prepare for, respond to, and recover from climate impacts. Integrated policy approach should be about loss and damage consideration must be woven into the fabric of all development planning. From agriculture to infrastructure, every sector must incorporate climate resilience. This resilience is key to building societies that can withstand and recover from climate shocks. Climate change transcends borders. Our response must do the same. We need a unified global effort, sharing resources, knowledge, and best practices. Only through collective actions can we hope to address this global challenge effectively. As we advance this agenda, we must commit to leaving no community behind. Our actions must be bold, our resolve unwavering. The path ahead is challenging, but together we can forge a more equitable and resilient world. Allow me to share how Samoa has contributed to this global effort. We have established a loss and damage fund with support from the New Zealand Climate Finance Program. This fund will operate over the next 2 to 4 years, enabling us to respond effectively to climate-related risks. We are developing a national framework on loss and damage to guide our efforts. Furthermore, we are actively engaged in regional capacity building initiatives. Samoa, through SPREP, has submitted a concept note for the Building our Pacific Loss and Damage Response Project. This project, involving Tuvalu, Republic of Marshall Islands, and Vanuatu, aimed to develop institutional capacity for loss and damage projects, engage communities to ensure locally tailored and accepted responses, improve access to finance, including the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, safeguard local values in policy making, and create comprehensive national loss and damage plans. The loss and damage agenda is not just about addressing past and present impacts. It's about shaping a sustainable future for all. It demands our immediate and sustained attention. Let this be our rallying cry for global solidarity. As we move forward, let us remember we are stronger together. United in our commitment to addressing loss and damage, we can ensure that no one is left behind in the face of climate change. Soifua mai manuia.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for articulating so well loss and damage from the perspective of small island states, from the perspective of Samoa and its community and people. Tanya, your question is around Indigenous people and communities significantly contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation through traditional knowledge that has sustained their lands, territories, and resources for generations. However, Indigenous people are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, not only because of the impacts on their ecosystems and livelihoods, but also because of cultural losses. What can we learn from Indigenous communities on preserving and sustainable use of land and resources? how our indigenous and traditional knowledge can help to minimize and address loss and damage. What mechanisms are there to help indigenous people?
Thank you, Philomena. So I really did struggle with this question, or the questions, sorry, and I was reminded back to how to base my conversation or my talk with you today, and it is a saying in Māori, which is e harataku toi i te tuataki tahi, engari he tuataki tini, which is mine is not the strength of one, but the strength of many. And so how I thought I would approach this is about the inclusive approach and the New Zealand story. And that is because New Zealand has different levels of engagement. All the countries have different levels of engagement, different structures and different frameworks. And just for a little bit of context, Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, are nearly 20% of New Zealand's total population. They constitute over 80 tribes throughout all the islands in New Zealand, and they're also owners of a multi-billion-dollar asset base. And I do apologise if I do swap between they and we, as I am also indigenous, or I'm descended from the North Island tribe of Ngāti Porou, which is on the east coast, one of the tribes that were impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle. So I have focused in on the inclusive approach because I wanted to get towards the end about how you can possibly make this work. And again, I acknowledge that governments are at different stages. Māori played a significant role in responding to events, and Māori continue to play a role in recovering from those events. The recent events that New Zealand has suffered have been the cyclones, Hale and Gabrielle, and before that, the large earthquakes in Kaikoura and Christchurch in the South Island. Those who were directly impacted, and my tribe included, responded for their community, not just for our people, but also for the community. And even as our commercial assets were being destroyed, washed away, or broken, even as our cultural areas and our cultural assets were either being massively damaged, our people's focus was still on the community as a whole, whether it be women, people with disability, children, elders. So their focus went completely onto responding to the community, because they are the best people, Māori and the community alone, to actually know who's who in that community and who actually needs the help. During these events, the tribes outside of the regions that were impacted also rallied around together to ensure that these communities were actually supported, and that was through the supply of money, through equipment such as Starlinks. I believe we nearly bought out probably everybody's supply of Starlink, generators. So the whole tribes in that around giving money, food, rallying around, clothes and all that had been provided. After the events had happened and the tribes and the areas had gone into recovery mode, Māori still had a role to play in this. And what we had to look at was, if Māori contributed so much, where is their place? Where is their place in being part of the solution rather than being brought on at the end? For the last 18 months, there have been significant inquiries and reviews into how the emergency management played out. And in each one of those reviews, they talked about how Māori did significantly contribute to the response. Now, in terms of the inclusive approach to loss and damage, my people acknowledge that there are some cultural assets that can never be replaced. They are unmeasurable and they're uninsurable as well. When we lose our ancestors, the graveyards, when we lose our landscape that talks about our ancestors, we know that they cannot be replaced. But what Māori have told the government is they want to be part of the solution. They want to be on that table that makes the decisions. They want to be on the table that plans for risk resilience and readiness so that we are better prepared to serve the community. We are still in the early stages of trying to pull. We're not quite there yet. But the one thing that the National Emergency Management Agency of New Zealand is doing is looking at what role do Māori play when it comes to response, what role do Māori play when it comes to risk identification. And one of those is the establishment of an emergency management When we go into response mode, we have functions set up in our emergency operating centres, and one of them is a Māori role, which will focus solely on the needs of Māori, but also bring the Māori worldview into any response. And the second thing is, and last thing, because I just got you have 1 minute left. And another thing that we are bringing forward is that the government's response to the inquiries that have just happened have also pointed out the contribution that Māori make, not only to themselves, but also their community. So I went for the inclusive approach answer. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tanya, for that very detailed response in clarifying that question. Jerome, how do you see the evolving landscape on loss and damage, including through the Santiago Network, helping countries to take a more inclusive approach to addressing loss and damage?
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Warsaw International Mechanism, I'm very much delighted and honored to be given the space to be part of this conversation. But first and foremost, allow me to thank Your Excellency for setting that out. I think that's the narrative that we all must carry on our way back home, because that's the narrative of this Manila event. The WIM-EXCOM is actually the first entity that was created out of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, directly responding to loss and damage. And we celebrated the 10th anniversary last year. And I think my conversation will be that of a bit of history, a bit of progress and opportunities, and of course, how this can be translated into call to action. As a party-driven process, the WIM is actually the mechanism that oversees the implementation of the mandate to avert, minimize, address loss and damage. Prior to the advent of Santiago Network and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, the WIM-EXCOM has been incessantly in coordination and collaboration with several operating entities of the financial mechanism like GCF and Jeff, for example. And we have been inviting in our meetings several scientific agencies also to make sure that the scientific underpinning of loss and damage is always part of that evolving architecture. And of course, as a party-driven process, it's not just about gaps and needs in terms of finance that's necessary. We have to underpin the capacity building of all the highly vulnerable parties or countries, and therefore, Santiago Network was born. And I think these milestones were articulated as part of the COP decisions in Dubai last year. But through the years, even before those milestones in Dubai COP last year, the WIM has been contributing to the increasing of awareness and capacities for actors on the ground by producing several knowledge products and technical guides. In fact, we will be launching in time for COP29 several technical guides for sea level rise, mobility, for cultural heritage, and loss of biodiversity, so that, these funding arrangements and the Santiago Network can be guided with the policies and scientific basis moving forward. But what makes this very inclusive? It's because the three entities now comprising the mechanism, we have the WIM, the Santiago Network, and the fund. It is hoped that the parties could have that, synergistic model also by which they can navigate action and support to avert, minimize, address loss and damage. But institutions are also important, and therefore, national contact points for the WIM-EXCOM will be strengthened as well. But exciting events in time for COP29 include that the WIM-EXCOM has initiated a meeting with the co-chairs of the Santiago Network Advisory Board, as well as the co-chairs for the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. It is hoped that more than the party-driven process, the WIM-EXCOM catalyzes with its convening power, all sorts of support under the convention and the agreement, so much so that we give meaning to what we have, labored for more than 10 years. We have launched a website for this purpose, and I think parties, especially those coming from our constituency, the Asia-Pacific region, can very well be part of the Santiago network through being, OBNEs. And we have Animesh here, who is actually the secretariat. So I hope one of the outcomes of this forum is to, call upon organizations, bodies, networks, and experts, whether a firm or individual, to be part of the network because of the unique complexion of the challenges to avert, minimize, address loss and damage. But I think Asia-Pacific has that one strong narrative. This is our common boat. We have to steer our journey together. And I think this Manila Forum is big step forward to be inclusive, to reverse the tide of loss and damage to that of resilience. Maraming salamat.
Salamat, Guru. Michelle, we know that disaster impacts are gendered. Women are more likely to experience economic losses during disasters because they are concentrated in insecure jobs that are often vulnerable to climate impacts. And they have limited access to financial resources, to rebuild homes, to reestablish access to livelihoods. At the same time, non-monetary loss and damage are also very often linked to women's activities and livelihoods. Given this, what would a gender-responsive approach to addressing loss and damage would look like, and why is it important from your view?
Thanks, Philomena. It's on? Okay. And thank you, Honourable Minister. Good afternoon. Well, look, I think firstly, just to introduce ActionAid, we are part of a global federation working in over 70 countries to advance women's rights and end poverty and injustice. And climate justice is at the forefront of our agenda, recognising that those who've done the least to cause the climate crisis are experiencing some of the worst impacts with fewer resources to cope. Supporting the leadership of women from disaster-affected communities is also central to our approach, given the disproportionate impact of climate change and disasters on women and girls. And both of these issues are very much central to the discussion around loss and damage that we're having today. I also want to highlight that in the Pacific, ActionAid is part of the Shifting the Power Coalition, which brings together 13 women-led organisations to support diverse Pacific women's leadership in climate and humanitarian action. And many of these groups, some of whom are in the room today, have been bringing gender perspectives on the losses faced by women as a result of climate change in the Pacific, including losses of culture and livelihoods. So my response to this question today actually is really drawing on findings from a new report that ActionAid countries in the region have launched today on transforming disaster response, women-led climate solutions in Asia and the Pacific. And if people are interested in learning more from this, we have some copies we can share at the end of the session. But this draws from experiences in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Nepal, Vanuatu, Vietnam, and my own country, Australia. And I guess the first thing I'd like to highlight is that we cannot consider loss and damage in isolation and must work to policy coherence across all climate finance mechanisms, including funding for climate change adaptation, mitigation, and of course the new Loss and Damage Fund. Similarly, policy and plans across the climate disaster nexus need to be aligned to drive a more coherent, gender-responsive approach. In looking at, I guess, some of the status in the region, we see that more than a third of nationally determined contributions from countries in Asia and the Pacific, which are the pledges to cut emissions and to adapt to climate impacts, are completely gender blind. Most are likely to frame women as victims rather than recognising their leadership and agency. and only 18% provide any dedicated funding to support women's participation. Less than half of national action plans on climate adaptation in the region recognise women as leaders, and only 7 have a focus on gender-responsive budgeting. So I guess what I want to highlight is explicit commitments are needed across climate and disaster plans, policies and funding mechanisms to address the gendered impacts of climate change, support women's leadership and participation, and provide gender-responsive finance. And in taking a gender-responsive approach, we also need to recognise that not all women's experiences are the same. While women are disproportionately impacted by climate change due to gender inequality, the impacts are not evenly felt. So this underscores the urgent need for gender, age and disability disaggregated data, as well as other vulnerability markers. Intersectional gender analysis is critical in determining the funding needs for women and other marginalised groups, as well as identifying barriers in accessing funding through existing mechanisms. So from ActionAid's perspective, there are 3 core pillars of a gender-responsive approach to loss and damage. Firstly, it's essential that we promote women's leadership in climate finance decision-making. Ensuring gender balance and diversity in funding decision-making is critical, including in the newly established Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. Gender assessments should also be integral to funding guidelines and evaluations. And secondly, it's essential that we improve transparency in climate finance flows, including the amount of national and international funding being directed to women-led and gender-responsive climate solutions. This is critically important as the latest data suggests that only 2.9% of global climate finance identified gender equality as a principal focus. Gender-responsive finance is needed to ensure funds are being allocated to address the distinct needs, role and contributions of women and to respond to climate losses. And thirdly, we need to focus on improving women's access to climate finance. Targeted funding needs to get into the hands of women's organisations, networks and coalitions that are best placed to address the disproportionate impacts and losses faced by women in climate disasters. This includes supporting these organisations to become accredited agencies or creating direct access mechanisms. And just finally on the second question, why does this matter? Because we're currently seeing one of the largest setbacks to gender equality in history, and climate change is a major driver. Right now, we are only on track to meet 2 out of the 18 indicators under SDG 5 on gender equality. Gender-blind policy, decision-making and financing is holding us back and failing to recognise the potential of half the population. A gender-responsive approach across the climate disaster nexus, including financing to respond to loss and damage, will ultimately reduce gender inequality and increase resilience to climate change and disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that. Anish, you have been strong advocates for loss and damage over the past few years. We've seen a lot of youth advocates at COP and the last 3 or 4 COPs, particularly in light of the threats it poses to the collective future, because of youth today will be our leaders tomorrow. What are some of the ways that your organization and youth in general have been taking to address the issue of loss and damage?
Thank you, Payamina, for this introduction, and thank you for an invitation to me to speak here and to share some of my thoughts. So it's been a wonderful to youth have been a major agents and key leading actor in advocating for inclusive loss and damage that reflect the need of all the components of the society, including youth, women, indigenous people, local communities, which is one of the major and essential factor in ensuring inclusive world which also caters the inclusive loss and damage, and that directly address the needs and priorities of the local communities. So youth have been taking action on the ground from the start of this discussion, from the very beginning of this issue that we have been, youth have been assembling in the various parts of the world, in the various discussions, various policy avenues, and the various on-the-ground action. And also not only in the forums or in the events, but also on the ground with their communities to discuss, to help, and to address, and also to take those issues that come from the discussion to this various levels. So it's not only COPE, we are going everywhere. We are trying to mobilize through, if I talk about myself, my organization, we are also mobilizing on the ground. We are representing and also assembling the youth voices for them to know the first approach and also the context and agenda of the loss and damage, and how that is affecting them, and how we can ensure our inclusive loss and damage through youth participation. So, and to engage them from the ground, to collect their voices, to represent their voices, and to try to take them to the various avenues to get that address. So that is the one key thing that we are doing, because without organizing, we cannot ensure that the youth or the actors of the societies or communities are participated, consulted, and also their voices are being represented in the key avenues that address and also that decides on their life and their livelihood. So this is the prime thing. And then we are also trying to advocate for the availability of adequate technical and financial resources for youth to learn, for them to understand, and also for them to address the agenda of the loss and damage. So there's a lot of negotiations that we have been learning about in the recent days, and also the adoption of the loss and damage in the recent COP27. So that is one of the key entering point for all of us to go on the inclusive loss and damage agenda through the inclusive loss and damage fund as well. So the agendas cannot be inclusive without the availability of the inclusive resources. So that is one of the key requirement for all of us to move ahead. And the youth are taking bolder voices on that they should be, and they have to be consulted, and they have to be represented, and not only they have to be represented, but also they should have the access and the priority of the governments, of the states, and the societies for them to get the resources on the loss and damage, because loss is about about the loss of human or economic loss. Loss is also of the youth future. Losses of my culture. Losses of my world that we have been envisioned. So it's not coming forward. So we have to make it forward. So we have to come forward. So as a youth, we are trying to advocate for the inclusion. So, and as we talk about youth, so there's a various youth that have to be come forward, and that has to be also inclusive within the youth itself also, because we come from the rural communities, we come from indigenous communities. So our voices, our generational issues has to be also be included and supported. So for the indigenous youth, with a diverse their representation, their diverse culture, their diverse situation has to be reflected in the inclusive loss and damage agenda, and through the organizing, through advocacy, and the on the ground action, we can ensure those agenda are reflected. And I call upon that the discussions to be directed and to be supported towards inclusive loss and damage, through inclusive loss and damage fund, inclusive loss and damage participation, and inclusive loss and damage decision that also makes all of our priorities, all of our issues, and all of our need addressed in inclusive and in a sustainable way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anish. Animesh, we can learn a lot from DRR approaches. in particular, whole of society approach to DRR planning and decision making. How can the loss and damage agenda draw on this DRR practices to inform inclusive and people-centered loss and damage policies and mechanisms?
Thank you. Thanks, Mana. I think this session that we're having today is coming at a very opportune time. We already heard about from Jerome how last 10 years plus of work has been ongoing in the agenda to set the context of loss and damage. And thanks to the political advocacy from the island countries in particular, for example, what Samoa, Minister from Samoa you outlined, and the youth, the civil society activism, I guess we are at a time where the loss and damage agenda is transitioning from just being a political agenda to a real programmatic technical agenda. We have key instruments at our hand to make this work. We have the fund for responding to loss and damage. We have the overall funding arrangements, and we have the Santiago network for technical assistance. How do we look into this loss and damage landscape and draw lessons from different other mechanisms, including disaster risk reduction, is the way to go forward. If 2015 was the year which we often refer to as the year of resilience, the year in which we had the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, all adopted in the same year, 2023, last year, was also the year where we took a step, paused, and took a stock of where we are in terms of our progress. We had the midterm review of the Sendai framework concluded. We had the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement done in the same year. And the two frameworks with the midterm reviews and the progress reviews had three core messages. One, we are not on track to achieve the goal. Two, our approaches are fragmented. And three, the only way we can come back on track is through synergies in our approaches. And that is what I would focus on, that how we can bring all of us together with our collective expertise in an inclusive manner. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve the goal by 2030. So I would try to structure my thought process in terms of this agenda under three key pillars: data, policy, and finance. On data, we cannot make use of all these loss and damage instruments if we don't know how much we are losing. We cannot manage what we cannot measure. And that's a key issue. If we can't quantify our losses, we don't understand our losses, we can't quantify, we can't monetize. And that's the key challenge at hand as of now. We just don't know how much we are losing. And forget about those areas of gaps which remain for a very long time. For example, the slow onset events and non-economic losses, which even we, with all the collective data efforts we have been doing in disaster risk reduction, have not been able to fulfill. And hence, the time has come to bring together our data expertise so that we know how much we are losing and how we can turn that into monetized actions. The second is policy. At the global policy level, we might have achieved some level of coherence, but at the national level, we remain very fragmented. Just to give an example, we have 130 countries as of now in the world who have a disaster risk reduction plan. We have 58 countries in the world which have a national adaptation plan. For the countries which don't, and as per the global stocktake call to action to have all the countries with an app by next year, we have three options. Either countries that have neither DRR plan nor an app, can they co-create these plans? Countries which have either of these plans, can they build upon each other to make the plan? And countries which have both, can we come together and co-implement? I think the Pacific countries are a very good example which have matured in their thought process on the integrated planning, and we just 2 weeks back had a very good workshop in Suva to talk about comprehensive risk management approaches to integrated planning. If we have the right data and we have the right policy framework, the country's absorptive capacity for managing these loss and damage instruments increases manifold. And that brings us to the point, what do we do? What does it mean for the communities? Data. We have done pretty well in terms of collecting data from the communities. We have not been able to do a good job in conveying that data back to the communities. Early warning remains a key challenge. We often talk about last mile outreach remaining the weakest block in the chain of early warning. We collect data, we don't convey back. If we don't convey back, they don't take action. And that remains the key area of work. Second is in terms of policy. The real level of coherence happens at the level of implementation. And that implementation is always at the level of community. We don't include the civil society, we don't include community in the policy framework process, we don't achieve the desired objectives. And then these 2 points again brings me to the third point, finance. Many of the financing instruments are often blocked and obstacled by intermediaries in between. If we don't provide the direct access to the communities, we will not be able to achieve the objectives of these instruments. Even in terms of the Santiago network, we are required to provide a minimum % of financing to the communities in a direct manner. If we don't empower the communities, we don't move forward together. And that's a collective action where the talk is. As I speak, our core messages from UNDRR for the COP29 is being uploaded online. And our headline message is financing is not a charity, but a responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, panel members. We will now give the floor for any questions from our participants. Right, good one. Anybody with a microphone to the young man here?
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, do you have a question as well?
Yeah.
Oh, can he go first and then to you?
Sure.
Thank you.
So my name is Razul, 14 years old and a child representative from World Vision Philippines. So I love your stories and solutions. And as a child representative, I represent children because we have the right to say our opinions and suggestions. Because I believe children are knowledgeable enough to give a suggestion in loss and damage agenda. We have been talking about inclusivity in this room, but I haven't heard how our children are going to be involved. So my question, as I heard earlier, you guys have a youth and gender inclusive approach. But do you have children inclusive approach? That's my first question. And my second question will be, and how are you planning to include children in your discussions? Thank you.
Can I hear your question and then we'll direct the questions to the relevant panel members. Please go ahead.
Hello? Yes, I'm Paul. I'm Paul Daniel Serrano. I'm from Negros Island. I'm a queer climate activist working with young people in my communities to empower them about climate justice, navigating the movement in Negros particularly. And my question would focus again on the loss and damage agenda. So how can young people, especially in grassroots organizations, work in solidarity with international bodies or national bodies to ensure that loss and damage financing reaches the communities that need it most?
Thank you very much. Can I ask Anish to respond to the question from children perspective? And maybe I can ask Jerome if you can respond to the question on access to financing by grassroots. If you can go first, Anish.
Thank you for this question, and I think this is very important point that you bring to all of our attention. As we know, children are the future of our society, and also it's a glass, it's a entry point to the nation's heart or the nation's leadership. As we begun from our childhood to adulthood in the transition to lead and to transform our society and country. So children are one of the major actor along with the children, adolescent and youth group who advocate for the inclusive loss and damage agenda. So they have always been a part of the major group, and they have been included in the discussion shaping on the key policy recommendations that we often submit for the inclusive loss and damage issues to be reflected in the loss and damage discussion and negotiations. So it's about the inclusion of the stakeholder group that the children have been always consulted, always bring into the table, and also always being heard. So as you are also participating today, you are letting your voice to be heard towards all of us, that how children are needed to be included, and what is your perspective, or what is your need and what is your issues and demands that you want us to hear. So that's what we always doing. So we are always trying to bring children through, and also to make them participate with the children, ursuline and youth groups, so that they can be alongside consulted, they can be alongside heard, and their priorities, their needs are to be documented and also to be submitted for the broader inclusion in the loss and damage agenda. So it's about intergenerational dialogue too. So always the children have been a part of intergenerational dialogue. So from the generation of the elders, from the generation of the youth who we are representing today, and all yourself as a children also being as on the discussion with the intergenerational perspective on each other, hearing each other stories and each other support to get the inclusive approach to our discussion, inclusive our approach to our issues, and inclusive approach to these submissions that we make, that make us able to make our initiative sustainable and also inclusive for the inclusive loss and damage for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anish, for that response. I can also clarify, at least for the Pacific region, with financial support from the Government of New Zealand through the Loss and Damage Fund, as well as through the Government of Germany, through the Building of Loss and Damage project in the region, there will be conversations with youth, representatives in the Pacific region that will be held next year, including the private sector and civil society. I think it's been well articulated in Honourable Minister's official speech or remarks that the issue of loss and damage is not even well defined. It's not even defined under the UNFCCC. The reason why, it's because loss and damage is different at the individual level, at the household level, clans, villages, islands. It's so different, all right? So can I ask Jerome, please, if you could respond to the question around the fund and access by civil society, grassroots.
Thank you so much for the question. In fact, allow me to articulate the answer by inviting everyone to refer to the thematic work streams of the WIMEXCOM. It's actually economic losses, non-economic losses, comprehensive risk management, mobility and action and support. Now, financing is actually a very unique, or it calls for unique propositions, really taking actions on the ground, highlighting the gaps and needs, defining the demographics. So with the advent of the Santiago Network and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, we have the platform to optimize for the scientific and parameters assessment, how we can actually contextualize the fund and how to access it. There are guidance or technical papers that we will be issuing in time for COP29. And one of the more exciting issues here is that those technical guides are actually meant for actors on the ground, therefore really approaching how to address the unique situations on LND by our communities. And we thank our expert groups. I mean, Animesh can attest to that, how rigorous it is to pass upon the technical papers, vetting globally with academia. And that's another point I'd like to make. We cannot advance without the stability of the academia as being integral to the process, because that's how we make established the knowledge, the science, and capacity. Because finance is just throughput. The core consideration is what progress can we make. And as youth, we define history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I open up the floor for other questions? Oh. Very persistent young man.
So
Thank you.
didn't get the answer that I was looking for. So I was actually, sorry, this is not
Go ahead.
to be laughed at. How do you include children and youth? Because last time I checked, children and youth are not similar. Children are 6 to 14 years old, and youth are 15 to 30, I guess. I think so. 35, yeah. So it's not similar. And the answer I was looking for is how do you include 6 to 14 years old in your, I'm sorry, yeah, in your agenda? Because as I said earlier, we have a strong opinions about this, and we deserve to be heard. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Would you like to?
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
Tanya as well.
If I may, but allow me to wear my national hat here because
Please go ahead.
as rep of the WIM EXCOM, I'm not wearing the national hat. But in wearing my national hat, and I'm saying this as a benchmark for the other countries as well, in our national adaptation plan, which was submitted early this year, we were approached by the Council for the Welfare of Children. And as government, we listened. And as government, we make sure that essential elements for the protection of children, you know, children, women, girls, children, that's how we build the continuum of resilience over time. That's a legacy building approach. And we appeal to to that inclusive process by embarking on our parents, because that's the status quo. And then we go down a bit, the youth. But children are being protected through institutions that are created by law specifically for that purpose. And I think one clear answer is that how do we include children is we work with the institutions, whether government or non-government alike, to make sure that your voices, the collective ones, are part of the process. But as part of the Climate Change Commission, we'll make sure to invite children to listen to their raw voices, unaffected perhaps by politics, but the sheer aspirations of what they envision 20, 30 years to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maybe Tanya and then Michelle.
So I'll just come from an indigenous point of view, and that was a really good question. In another life, I also worked for a Crown Research Institute called GNS Science, which are New Zealand's advisors on geothermal, earthquakes, everything that goes like that. So we have programs running up and down some parts of our country which conclude, and Māori separate the two as well. Children are tamariki and the youth are called rangatahi, because they're at different stages of understanding, but they are very important because they are our knowledge holders. There are programs being run up the East Coast at the moment that are being trialled, and I did believe I heard either Fiji or Vanuatu are running programs. But those kids are the messengers and they are the knowledge holders, because we know that if we told their parents about loss and damage, it's through one ear and out the other. They're not conveying it back. But if the children are told that, and if the youth are told that, they're going to keep that in that house and remind their parents what not to do and what to do. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on children and on youth in New Zealand, and we just got to get those programs up and running. And we don't do it on our own. We ask them, how do you learn? How do you hold knowledge? Because it's no use us dictating to the youth and to children about how to do things, because, again, in that ear and out the other. Thank you.
I would just add, I don't know, is it working? Hello? I'd just add, I mean, even though ActionAid focuses on women's leadership, we do work in communities and what we call local rights programs, where we're working with communities over a 10-year period, including children. And I think, and part of that process in sort of thinking about development objectives is to work and to consult with children. And I think it is important. I think that right at the moment, the world is failing future generations, and we do need to have more spaces for consulting and hearing voices. I think there's a reality, and I think, you know, this has been said by other speakers, that there are intermediaries speaking on behalf of children. I think what I hear you asking for is a greater space for, you know, children to be part of the conversation, to understand what's going on in these spaces, and to facilitate that. So I think it's a challenge to all of us to do better.
Okay. Yeah. I want to add a little bit from a national government standpoint. And first of all, my view is different cultures, different mechanisms. So we can't say what works in Philippines in a separate, how Filipino treat children is the same as how we in Samoa treat our children. our way of teaching is not necessarily not giving the space to our children. Our role is to tell stories to our children. And by telling them the stories of what we know, that's how oral tradition is passed through. And from that listening, we don't expect them to make the decisions when they're 4 or they're 6 or they're 10. We want them to learn as much about our environment and what's going on. What we learn from as adults is we pass on to our children. And that's the first part of us giving a voice for the children, because if you understand and know everything because of what we learned, then you will get to a position that you can be able, as you get to youth, then you'll have more, you'll expand your horizons and identify areas that you can provide input. So I can't say that we will be providing space for all the children in Samoa to come up and stand and say something. We want them to actually learn first. And it comes then to the action of youth. When I became minister 4 years ago, we didn't have a mechanism at the country level to ensure that our youth are represented at the international arena. Our youth would get funding from different agencies and go. We will see them at the Climate Change Convention. So I had started a program that we had a youth program at the national, building the whole year, getting the different types of youth, but also encouraging our youth, because what I also found was we had a lot of youth that turn up to international meetings like this, but don't actually do anything back home. So my first priority was to ensure the youth that are actually planting the mangroves in the villages, the youth that are actually doing the work, their voices are being heard, and their issues are being heard and being taken in by government. So we have a national process to ensure that all those youth are being consulted, and they also become part of Samoa's national delegation to the climate change, including our current pageant, Miss Samoa and Miss Pacific. That's how much we're here. So, and our youth leaders, different types of youth leaders. So each year we try to increase the involvement of youth, but they don't just turn up to the meeting. They become part of our national consultation in terms of preparing our national position, so that they are also made accountable to the rest of the youth that can't attend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. Maybe if I can invite Animesh to respond, and maybe just to wrap up our session, because I've been given the wrap-up sign. Thank you.
Great. So I'll be very fast. I think I'm very happy to see the interesting spin that the session has taken, led by the children and youth of the house. And only goes on to show that just day before yesterday, we celebrated the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the theme this year is empowering the next generation for a resilient future. So what better way to celebrate this but by empowering the children to take the stage? My request in terms of how children can really contribute to this process is twofold. One, go back to your school and ask if the schools are safe, are they resilient? And two, every time somebody uses the term natural disaster, please call it out. There is nothing called natural disaster. When we say natural disaster, we blame the nature, which we as human beings, we are responsible for the disasters, and every disaster is a failure of human beings, including climate change. Let's call that out every time, which is a hashtag called No Natural Disaster. Let's popularize that. I would also wanted to let you know that Santiago Network in its advisory board has a representative of children and youth. So please use the agency of children and youth to relay your messages to the highest possible governing mechanisms. But at the end, as I said, only through collective actions we can move forward. Climate change is a complex emergency. The solution can't come from one quarter. It has to come from every domain, every action from all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to end because another session is coming up to use this room. Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, for your time, and our panel here for sharing your knowledge and the stories with all of us. And I'd like to thank our young people who stood up and asked those very brave questions. Thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you. Good evening.